Streaming. Well, now it is my pleasure to introduce Clark Barrett from the Anthropology Department of UCLA, whose lecture is entitled Deciding What to Observe, Possibilities and Challenges for a New Generation of Cross-Cultural Studies.
Should I sit down? Is it better to sit? Gracias, Pablo. Primeramente, quiero agradecerles a Pablo y también al grupo Mente y Lenguaje por nos haber invitado aquí y por organizar nuestra conferencia. Es un gusto para mí estar aquí con ustedes otra vez. Desafortunadamente no voy a dar mi charla en español, voy a cambiar a inglés, pero quisiera agradecerles. Gracias. Today, I would like to take the opportunity to talk about possibilities and challenges for cross-cultural research. I've been asked to write 2 different papers for journals about the challenges facing cross-cultural research. And right now, on the occasion of the 10th anniversary of a very well-known paper, which I'll mention, called known as the Weird paper, which Henrik et al., which appeared in BBS 10 years ago. And so I wanted to take this opportunity to preview some of the ideas that I want to present in those papers, and also using this as an opportunity to reflect on some of the opportunities that have arisen in this project, in the Geography Philosophy project, but also some of the challenges that have been posed to all of us. And I think that's going to be one of the topics that we talk about over the course of the meeting. So I want to see this as a kind of double-edged sword, as it were. That our project has afforded us many opportunities that we haven't had before to do this kind of work, but it's also raised challenges as well. And I think that will provide some good lessons for this kind of work going forward. So the title of my talk comes from this very well-known quote. It's not actually a quote, but it's attributed to Einstein, which is, "It is the theory which decides what we can observe." I think that this has my interpretation of what he meant here is that there's a strong and a weak possible meaning of this. I think that the strong version of this is probably not true, but I suspect that what he meant was something along the lines of when we're constructing our investigations, when we're building experiments, when we're constructing interviews, and so on, there's theoretical motivations for designing our investigations as we do. And in that sense, because the way that we design our research is informed by theory in some sense decides what we can observe. But you can contrast this view from Einstein with a very different view from Feyerabend, where he says the only pressing reason for changing a theory is disagreement with facts. Discussion of incompatible facts will therefore lead to progress. Discussion of incompatible hypotheses will not. Hence, it is sound procedure to increase the number of relevant facts. This also strikes me as absolutely true. And if you read it strictly, it's of course in conflict with what Einstein says, because if it's true that you can only see what your theory allows you to see, then you'll never change your theories unless you go outside of the theories. So what I want to argue here is that one of the things that we have not paid sufficient attention to in cross-cultural research is the way that we formulate our theories, the way that we construct our methodologies for measuring those across cultures. I'll be raising 3 different problems that I think are problems at this current moment for cross-cultural research. And this is going to be the last one that I discuss. But I think that there's interconnected challenges here. So as I mentioned, I'm giving this talk on the occasion of the forthcoming occasion of the 10th anniversary of this paper, which appeared in Behavioral and Brain Sciences and coined the acronym WEIRD, which stands for Western Educated, Industrialized, Rich, Democratic. And in this paper, Joe Henrik and colleagues highlighted several of the problems that I'm going to mention today. Most strongly, they pointed out that the research participants in most social science research come from an unrepresentative portion of the world's populations. and that the people that we include in research in general in social science might be particularly unrepresentative of the kinds of things that we want to know about how the human mind works. So I'm specifically going to be addressing my comments today towards cognitive science, but I think they apply more generally to behavioral science in general. This paper was published in 2010. It raised issues which many people in social science were already aware of. It wasn't the first paper that brought this to the attention of the community. Especially anthropologists have been aware of this for a long time, and I'm an anthropologist. So in my community, this is well known, less well considered in psychology and other parts of cognitive science. And I think that it's safe to say that the paper had some good effects. 10 years on, we can say that after the weird moment, or in this post-weird moment that we're in, cross-cultural research has increased both in scope, the kinds of questions that we ask, in scale, the number and kinds of populations that we look at. And this particular project that we're all part of now is an example of that, where, as Pablo mentioned, we're looking at quite a number of different language groups and societies in this work, and that's becoming more and more common in cross-cultural research, to have studies that include half a dozen languages, maybe even a dozen or more languages and cultural groups. So that's good. And these studies are also increasing in visibility. So they're starting to appear in top journals and to gain more widespread attention around the world. So that's all good. And I think that those are in part a consequence of the awareness of the kinds of problems I'll be discussing that was raised by the weird paper. But we still have a long way to go. So I think there's actually many problems that a post-weird generation of researchers is going to have to face, but I'm going to boil these down into what I see as three main problems. One of them is what I'll call the representativeness problem, which I alluded to already, and which is the main problem that's raised in the weird paper, which has essentially two facets. One is that the research participants in most social science research are not particularly representative of humanity in general. But there's another facet, which I'll get to at the end, which is also that the researchers conducting this research are also not representative of humanity in general, a less well-noticed part of the problem. A second and related feature here, which is what I'll call the validity problem, and what I mean by validity is the validity of the inferences that we draw from our research. So in the case of cognitive science, we're doing work to try to make inferences about the human mind and how it works. And in order for those inferences to be valid, there have to be proper connections between the questions that we ask, how we ask them, and then the conclusions that we draw. And I think that we're actually seeing in this project that there can be lots of issues there. So one of the things that we're doing in this project is very, very careful translation of our materials, but I will point out that that's only one part of ensuring the validity of our findings. And then finally, I'll address what I think is the least attended to part of, at least attended to one of these problems, which is what I'll call the scope problem, and that is the scope of questions that are asked in cross-cultural research. I actually think that there's a fairly limited scope to the kinds of questions that we are currently asking in cross-cultural work. And I think that that problem has many facets, which I'll address at the end. So first, let me address the representativeness problem. And there's many ways into this, but I think one way to illustrate this problem is by thinking about what scholars in the Anthropocene literature have referred to as the Great Acceleration. This refers to the rapid changes that are occurring right now and have been occurring for many centuries around the world. We can see here, this is a graph of the world's population that shows that just in the past few hundred years, there's been an incredible acceleration in the world's population. And anthropologists have asked, what effect does this have on the way that people live around the world, and in turn on the way that they think? This is a series of charts from this Stefan et al. Paper in 2007 that sort of breaks down various features of what they call the Great Acceleration, ranging from not just population growth, but to things like in the middle here, the number of people living in cities. We have more people living in cities than ever before in human history, and to things like the use of telephones for communication, and even the number of McDonald's restaurants around the world. What relevance does this have for cognitive science? Well, essentially what we have here is increasing expansion of certain kinds of certainly production technologies, but also the expansion of capitalism, of capitalist markets, and those particular ways of life around the world. And it's an important and open question for cognitive science, how these ways of life impact the mind and people's ways of thinking. There's a well-known example from neuroscience that we know that reading and exposure to reading throughout your lifetime radically restructures your brain in ways that can be seen in fMRI scans. There's a question, using cell phones, using Instagram, using the internet, how does that restructure your brain, and how does it shape the way that we think, including in important domains such as domains like knowledge, wisdom, and understanding, morality, and so on. There's a question. Globalization may be having huge effects on the way that people interact with each other, and therefore on the way that people think. And that poses a challenge for cognitive science if what we're actually measuring is essentially the products of the Great Acceleration, or are we measuring fundamental features of how human minds work evolutionarily? Unfortunately, it's getting weirder. Again, using this acronym from Henrik et al., Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, each of those components of the weird phenomenon are also accelerating. I won't go through all of these, but the world is turning into a weirder and weirder place by the day. Now, there have been efforts to examine the representativeness problem in various areas of cognitive science. This is one particularly useful paper by Mark Nielsen and colleagues, where they survey, in particular in the area of developmental psychology, where the research participants come from in developmental psychology studies by sampling a variety of major journals in the field. And you can see that the vast majority, over 90% of participants in developmental psychology, come from so-called weird populations. You can break this down graphically and see that from 2008 to 2015, you don't see a terrible amount of budging, of changing of this particular distribution. So here, if you add up the bottom three colors there, United States, English-speaking, and European, the blue, the green, and the yellow, you can see that they account for 90% of the research in developmental psychology, which means that any conclusions that we draw about the minds of children and how development works are going to be influenced by whatever factors are held in common around these particular societies. If we look at a world map, we see that this particular slice of humanity that's depicted in this bar chart on the upper left is really just a small portion of the world's population. And actually, this is a population density map of the Earth. Most of the world's population is outside of those areas. As I mentioned, we think often about the problem of how research participants are distributed in cognitive science research, but there's another problem that has begun to be raised, which is how the actual researchers themselves are distributed around the world. Here is a map, a very unfortunate map, which shows how scientific publications are distributed by country, where this is a kind of map where the area of the country is proportional to the number of publications that are produced by that country. And you can see several trends here, including that the vast majority of scientific publishing comes from the global north, from countries north of the equator, and that representation by continents in the Southern Hemisphere, including the continent that we're on right now, as well as Africa, are quite small, disproportionately small. And so it's worth reflecting on what effect that this has on cognitive science, on the conclusions that we draw, the questions that we ask, and the conclusions that we draw. So this representativeness problem has multiple facets. The participants are drawn unequally from around the globe. And if we think about this as a sampling problem, so if we want to get sort of statistical about it, and we ask, how do we sample these research participants to solve this problem? If you think about something like a statistically representative sampling strategy, something akin to throwing darts at the map of the world, if you do that, you will sample almost entirely from people who are part of, well, neoliberal economies, countries that are steeped in long histories of capitalism and so on. In order to find people whose ways of life and ways of thinking are perhaps different in interesting ways for cognitive science, you might have to actually sample in some ways intentionally outside of that distribution. And I think that that's one of the strategies that we're pursuing in the Geography of Philosophy project. Although I would say, you know, we're doing that intentionally, but we're probably not doing as systematically as we could. And in future projects, I think that would be something to shoot for. To really mindfully think about who we're sampling, what kinds of questions that we ask. And this problem of how our ideas are disproportionately influenced by the cultures from which the researchers come, that's something that anthropologists have been discussing quite a bit in recent years, and I'll return to that at the end of the talk. So we want to ask ourselves, what are the implications of this for the accuracy of our picture of the human mind, if we take that to be the goal of cognitive science? Okay, let me turn briefly to the validity problem, which also has many facets, and I'm just going to give you a few examples here. To introduce this problem, this is something that will be well known to many people in the room. The field of psychology and other fields as well are undergoing what's sometimes called a reproducibility crisis. There's been many papers on this, but empirically there's been demonstrations that psychology is facing a validity problem, meaning that the inferences that psychologists are drawing, many of them are false. Many more of them are false than might have been thought a decade or two ago. This was a paper by a group called the Open Science Collaboration, in which they systematically tried to replicate or perform again 100 different studies that were randomly selected from some of the top journals in the field. This created a huge scandal because what they found was that the effect size of the original studies was greatly reduced in the replications. Whereas almost all of the original studies had significant results at the level of p is less than 0.05, so 97% of them had that. In the 100 replications that were done, only 36% of those replications had significant results. You can see graphically the problem here, where along the x-axis you have the original effect size of the study. So that would be something like, if you're thinking about the effect that one variable has on another variable, the effect size would be how big the effect of one variable has on another. If these studies perfectly replicated, you would expect to see them all along the diagonal line, where the original effect size, where if you had a large original effect size, you would also have a large replication effect size. But in fact, what you see is many studies that are along the horizontal line there, meaning that they were studies that originally were shown to have a large effect, but had no effect at all in the replication. And then there's a question, why is this? There's been a big debate in psychology about why this is, because there's a lot of possible reasons for why you might have this. Certainly one thing that you'd conclude is that we're making a lot of mistakes in the inferences that we draw from this research. Many conclusions that psychologists draw are mistaken. And the take-home message that I want to draw here is, to the extent that this is a problem for psychology being run in the lab, in people, university students being drawn from that are typically participants in subject pools, it's going to be an even bigger problem for cross-cultural research of the kind that we're doing. So let me give you an example of a kind of validity problem that I think that we face in this project. and that enterprises such as experimental philosophy face. This, if you go online and you look for a Big Five personality test online, you can take a Big Five personality test where you'll answer a bunch of questions and it'll tell you where you land on the different Big Five personality dimensions. This is the first question on this test. On a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you agree with the following statement? I am the life of the party. Now, there's a lot of anthropologists in the room, and you might just reflect to yourself if you went to ask people across different cultural settings, maybe if you went to various places in Lima or small villages in Peru and you asked this question, what would the meaning of this question be? We know from anthropological research that the interview is a kind of genre, and only some people are familiar with the genre of the interview. This is a classic anthropological phenomenon. This is from a book by Charles Briggs called Learning How to Ask, in which he points out that there's a huge pragmatic envelope surrounding the interview, where if you know that you're in an interview and if you know what an interview is, there's a certain performativity to answering the questions. You understand why the people are asking the questions, you understand the gist of what they're trying to get at. And for those of us who are steeped in that tradition, saying, how much do you agree that you're the life of the party? That makes a fair amount of sense, assuming that you know what a party is, and assuming that a party has the kind of significance in your culture that it does in the culture that this question was drawn from. But if you don't know what an interview is and you're being asked this question, then there's this whole frame of the social role of the interviewer and the significance of answering the question, where the answers that we might get might be quite different than what they were intended to measure by the people who put this on a personality test. And there's many facets of this, including things like counterfactuals, where you ask people to say what they think would happen in a very bizarre situation. That's something that's actually a staple of experimental philosophy. We've tried to reduce that as much as possible in this project, the giving to people of extremely bizarre, unnatural situations and asking them what they think about them, but that's a standard method in psychology and experimental philosophy. And the implications of answering a question under those circumstances are quite different when you know what an interview is, you know what an experiment is, than when you think you're being asked that question in a normal way, under normal Gracian conditions by another human being. Same goes, I do a lot of child research. One of the things that we do a lot in developmental work is we ask children rhetorical questions to which the experimenter and the child both know the answer, and the answer is obvious. And in those circumstances, you expect the child to simply agree with you. So if you ask a question like, hey, are the lights on right now? We ask questions to children like that all the time in psychology interviews. And it would not be unreasonable for a child to look at you if you asked that question and said, what in the world are you talking about? Can you not see that the lights are on too? Nevertheless, we take it as data that children are supposed to say yes to that question. If they say anything else, it's as if they don't understand what we're asking them, when in fact they might understand it perfectly well. That's a big problem in developmental work. I'll just give one example. This is a study that I find particularly interesting from my colleague at UCSB, Mike Gervin, that attempted to use these personality questionnaires in a group of Chimane people from Bolivia, asking if they have the same personality dimensions. So there's in Western psychological research, there's basically 5 dimensions of personality variation, and Mike and colleagues tried to, with a sample of about 800 Chimane people, to find out, do they have the same personality structure? They faced a lot of these kind of, they're not really I guess you could call them translation problems. So they would, for items like, are you clever and analytical? Already a question, if you ask that about yourself and you're answering the question about yourself, is that a reasonable thing for you to self-report about? But they translated that as knows how to see things and make things turn good, because that was the best way to translate it into Chimane, but doesn't mean the same thing. Radiates enthusiasm was translated as you really show to others whatever it is you want to show, because there are no Chimane words for radiate or enthusiasm. They removed one question, has an active imagination, because there was essentially no way to express that appropriately to Chimane people. And so, we've faced these problems in the Geography of Philosophy project, we treat it as relatively unproblematic to simply take the words in English and have them translated into the other language and translated back. If you do that, you get, I guess, what you'd call something close to a literal translation. But there are conceptual issues as well that we face. And we've tried to grapple with that in the Geography of Philosophy project, but I really feel like I, for one, have learned that this is something where we really have to attend to what the meaning of these things will be to the research participants and then what we conclude from what they say. Because one conclusion that you might draw is that there's a genuine difference. One of the things that Mike Girvin found was that the big five personality traits do not replicate in Tsimane people. I won't go through the details here, but this basically shows the overlap between these measures in Tsimane and American participants, and they're not high based on the standards of the field. And then the question arises, is that because Tsimane people have a fundamentally different personality structure? That actually is one of the conclusions that they entertain, which I think we should entertain. But based on this validity problem, you also have to wonder, is this really the appropriate way to measure this? Are we making the right inference when we say the big five personality dimensions do not exist in the Tsimane? So this is, I think, a big problem for our research. And there's lots of aspects of validity that especially experimental psychologists talk about. And I just want to point out that these are concerns for psychologists working within their quote-unquote own culture, using theories drawn from their culture and applied to people from that culture. Imagine how much bigger the problem is when translated across cultures. And then, what if the theories that we're testing are in some ways themselves culture bound? That's what I'm going to turn to next. So this is what I call the scope problem, where I mean the scope of the kinds of questions that we ask and the kinds of theories that we test. And this proposal is perhaps going to be the most radical one. I have some experience with this. Several of us here do, based on prior studies. There was a study that Steve and I participated in looking at variation in moral judgment across cultures. This is just a chart drawn from work by John McHale, who's a cognitive scientist of the law, who looks at legal systems and basically the encoding of kind of moral principles within legal systems, and makes some pretty strong claims about the universality of morality based on the universality of legal systems. He doesn't do so in a completely, he's aware of this problem that the law is not the same as morality, but at the same time, this is just half of one of his charts where he surveys the world's legal systems and then asked how principles of sort of mental inferences about others' mental states, including things like intentions, knowledge, motivations, and so on, impact the legal judgments that we might make about them. So something like the difference between first and second degree murder, which has to do with the mental state of the person committing the act. He finds that in most legal systems around the world, there's some role of thinking about the mental states of the agent in determining guilt. The problem, of course, is that most of those legal systems are derived from one or a few historical traditions of law. So we went, my colleagues and I conducted a study largely in the global south and largely in small-scale societies, starting to ask what the role is of mental states in moral judgment, meaning how do judges of others' actions take into account the mental states of the people that they are making judgments about when deciding whether they're guilty of a crime, for example, or whether they should be punished or blamed. And I won't go through this in detail, but one of the things that we find, the top graph shows that the difference between performing a harmful act or an act with some kind of bad outcome intentionally versus by accident. And so the larger the bars are, the larger the difference there is between doing a bad thing on purpose and doing a bad thing by accident. And what we find, if you look on the left, is that there are some societies where there's a relatively small difference, meaning that they judge generally more based on the outcome than on the intentions of the actors. Something that anthropologists have claimed is true in a lot of societies around the world, but hasn't really been grappled with by the legal community, or for that matter in cognitive science, where it's fairly common to make universalist claims about the role of intentions in moral judgment. There's complicated interactions, which we still have to investigate between the situation and the effect, the situation, the culture, and the effect that the mental states play in moral judgment. And we do find some degree of support for that there are certain kinds of mentalistic factors that will excuse bad acts that are fairly common across cultures, like self-defense, for example, which is codified in a lot of the world's laws. So, there's some room for universality here, probably a lot of room for universality, I think, but you can't answer these questions without doing the cross-cultural work. How am I doing on time, Pablo? I'm almost done. Okay. Okay, so here's a more radical claim. A question is, so this idea of decolonizing science is very popular in anthropology now. It has many meanings. And so I just want to raise this question for us. In what ways is cognitive science, in what ways could cognitive science be usefully decolonized in ways that actually matter theoretically? So there's lots of ways in which decolonizing science might matter. I want to focus in particular on the theoretical ways in which it might matter. And what do I mean by this? What I mean is that if you take a class in cognitive science, you'll find that it's grounded generally in a Western philosophical tradition. So you'll learn about Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Descartes, Locke, Hume, Kant, all the way up through Skinner, Piaget. What do all these people have in common? Lots of things. Obviously, they're all white men. And they all come from a particular kind of European philosophical tradition. My point here is that it might be useful for us to ask in what way, if what we're trying to ask is, if we're naturalists about the mind, as I am, I come from an evolutionary cultural tradition which sees the human mind as essentially a biological entity that's the product of biological evolution combined with cultural tradition and cultural history. Those are the factors that shape the mind. Then it's really useful for us to ask ourselves, and evolutionary social scientists have been doing this for a while, well, if we're being naturalistic about the mind and the object that we're trying to study is an object that's the product of these long-term processes, in what ways are theories derived from a European philosophical tradition useful or not useful for finding out the reality about that thing? I think sometimes they are. I mean, I'm not trying to say that they're not useful. I think that this philosophical tradition has been immensely productive. But I think there are cases where you could say perhaps progress in understanding how the mind works and how the mind is structured has been impeded by the historical constraints that we face, because the questions that we asked are framed by this tradition, and so therefore the answers that we seek. I'm circling back around to Einstein's point that the theory determines what we can observe, right? If we're using theories that are coming from a particular tradition, that's going to basically shape the questions that we ask and the answers that we can get. And there's some examples, but one that I find for me particularly useful is if you read recent literature in moral psychology, you get questions that from very, very prominent people in this area, like, well, is human morality Kantian, or is it Humean, or is it Rawlsian? I'm not saying those are not useful questions, right? But that is when you think about it, that is a weird, and I use that word in both senses of the term, that is a kind of weird way in some ways of framing the problem. If what we're talking about is a mind that is the product of evolution, where whatever we think of as morality is likely to be some sort of constellation of mechanisms that carry out social functions in the service of survival and reproduction and things like that, right? And that have various kinds of social and cultural functions. It's not a meaningless question to say, is morality Kantian? But is it really where all of the gravity of the field should be focusing? Are there better questions that we can ask about the nature of morality than those questions? If to the extent that huge history in moral philosophy influences our questions, how do we step outside of that box to ask different questions? Another example for me, I do work in cognitive development, is the debate about nativism versus empiricism. Again, it's a cogent distinction. But if you go into the philosophy of biology, there's essentially unanimity among biologists that this is not a useful binary. Every single philosopher of biology will tell you that learned versus innate is really not quite the right way to carve things up. Nevertheless, that has been the motivating factor, I would say, in the vast majority of developmental psychology research, to answer questions about, is this thing learned or is it innate? And then you might ask, reasonably, well, how do you do research outside of that framework? What would be the other alternative? I do think there's other alternatives. I've written some about that. I think there's ways to think about how development works biologically that doesn't deny this distinction, but makes it much more biologically realistic. Thinking about, for example, how the mind is more active in that the mind is when it's developing is in some ways actively building a cognitive system rather than passively accepting information from the environment or simply operating on some kind of innate template. There are ways to do things differently, but that's a case where debates between 19th century European philosophers have driven research almost entirely in this area. So it's useful for us to ask, in which cases is it the case that the weird theory decides what we can observe? And when should we reject framings of a problem that come from a historically particular tradition? So that's what I mean in this particular case by decolonization. It has many meanings in anthropology, but I think in cognitive science we can think of it very usefully in this way, that there's a sense in which we should be constantly asking ourselves, how can we, in what cases is our research being driven by a historical framework that could be usefully questioned and where we could step outside of that framework? Final example I'll give that some people in this room will resonate with. An area that I've done a lot of work in is what's sometimes called intuitive ontology and core domains. So there's a large literature in cognitive science and developmental psychology that asks basically, how does the human mind carve the world up into different kinds of entities for the purpose of thinking about those entities? And there's multiple viewpoints here, but there's a very common and popular view that believes that the mind carves the world into what's called core domains. And those can be, depending on your point of view, they're partitioned out differently, but there's a lot of people who think that there's something like an intuitive psychology that carves the world into things that have minds and things that don't, and then treats the things that have minds in a particular way. Intuitive biology that carves the world into living things and non-living things and applies a particular set of inferences to one versus the other. Intuitive physics, intuitive sociology, that's a more recent proposal, that there's a sort of core domain of thinking about groups. And then things like intuitive math, intuitive statistics, and intuitive number. And so there's a lot of people in cognitive science who think if you go into human minds everywhere, human minds are partitioned into these particular kind of faculties for thinking about the world that entail an ontology, an intuitive ontology, a belief about how the world is carved. Now, what would the map of this particular landscape of intuitive ontology look like? Well, here's a map of the UCLA campus, and this is what it looks like here. There's the Department of Sociology, the Department of Physics, the Department of Psychology, the Department of Mathematics, and the Department of Biology. What a strange coincidence that the faculties that the mind is supposed to be composed of also correspond to university departments, right, at UCLA. Now, it's possible that that is because Western science has happened to hit upon the departmental carvings that correspond to the natural carvings of the human mind. I think that's a possibility. But there are I think we can all agree that there's another possibility, which is that there's a projection of the academic structure of how academics carve the world up onto the minds of people. Now, I'm not saying that there's not a lot of evidence for this core domain theory. I mean, I've contributed to that area as well. I think there's some evidence for it. But the studies that have been done to look at this are not trying to actually systematically ask, I think, challenge this question of, are these carvings really the the right carvings. Instead, they say things, well, like, do people everywhere see the world as having groups? Well, yes, they kind of do. So that's evidence, quote unquote, for intuitive sociology. Do people make probabilistic inferences? Yes, they do. That's evidence for intuitive math, right? So that part is perhaps okay, but it is a little strange then to go from that to this inference that the domain structure exactly reflects the domain structure of universities. So that's an example I think we should question. And actually, research in South America can play a central role in this, especially because of work done in particular in Amazonian societies that suggests that the intuitive ontology that people from many South American societies have doesn't exactly correspond to the intuitive ontology that's suggested by that core cognition area. And I mean, this is, Alejandro has been doing some work on this. I mean, I think this is an area where there a lot more could be done. And this is exactly the kind of thing where sort of experimental philosophy in different cultures and selecting particular cultures that might expand our view of how the mind is organized could be particularly useful. And I think there could be more biologically plausible alternatives. I've suggested some myself. This is not my scheme. This is from David Geary, but you know, this in some ways reproduces that scheme a little bit, but is a little bit more fine-grained and thinks about the domains more from the from an evolutionary perspective, which I think is possibly a better way to do it. But my point here being, this is not the only alternative. Thinking about the mind as composed of university departments is not the only way to think about it, and there's other possibilities. They should be tested just more rigorously. Not a lot of scrutiny has been given to that, in fact. Okay, so I do think the good news is that we, social and cognitive and behavioral scientists, have a growing awareness of the culture boundness of our fields and these various kinds of problems facing research. One good news about that is I think if you go to any, well, I think in general, I've had mixed experience on this. I've given talks about cross-cultural research. I think most academics that I encounter think that cross-cultural research is a good idea. I think there are some interesting exceptions of people who think that it actually is not very useful because the answers that we find elsewhere are probably going to be the same. I've actually heard people say that. But in general, I think there's openness to cross-cultural work. Not only openness to it, but actually recognition that it's important. But we still have a really long way to go. People in this room are doing, I think, really important work on this. And I think that this project can be a sort of leveraging point for thinking going forward about how we might continue to do this better, because we've all seen that we've run into problems on this project, but there will be future projects that we're all part of. Uh-oh. And that's Templeton calling because they're upset. Not only must we expand the exclusiveness of our research designs, we have to rethink what they're measuring and sometimes even the very theories they're grounded in. That latter part I think we don't think about enough in cognitive science. And then my final point, which I think many of us will agree with, is this isn't just, you know, a kind of armchair exercise. There's an urgency to this because of things like the great acceleration that I was pointing to at the beginning, the spread of capitalism, the spread of neoliberalism, however you want to think about it, the spread of certain kinds of cultural ideologies that and ways of life that are, you know, they're not going to slow down. The problem is accelerating. So there's an urgency to this because we risk mistaking certain cultural traditions for the structure of the mind itself. And so there's a very theoretical reason for this. As cognitive scientists, if we want to understand what human minds are like, we don't want to make the mistake, you know, for example, of looking only at literate people and then making a conclusion about, you know, the way that about the reading parts of the brain, that those are a fundamental part of the human mind, because they're not. They're the result of a particular historical tradition and particular kinds of experience. And that risk is getting greater and greater and greater as time goes on. So there's urgency to this, and I hope that funding agencies, including Templeton, recognize that. Thank you very much.